So, very warm welcome to the second session. I would rather say third session because there were two lectures in the first session. So, the third lecture. My aim in this lecture is to expose the whole field of transforms. But I know that many of you are already familiar with transforms. I mean, you might have some exposure to transforms. But what I wish to do is to give a slightly different perspective, while of course reviewing all the basic properties. Now, what I also intend to do, as Professor Sachin Patwardhan said in the morning, this is not just a formal course on mathematics and engineering. It's also an effort at building pedagogical skills, or I mean, instead of being so pretentious, saying sharing pedagogical experience. Now, what I intend to do in this session, of course, is to, most of the communication will be one way, in the sense that I would be discussing certain ideas. But in the session after lunch, I would want it to be a participative process in which all of you will actually be participating in certain discussions in terms of the pedagogy of how we should be teaching certain ideas in the Fourier transform or the Laplace transform, or how we might use ideas in transforms in our respective engineering disciplines. So, I shall come to what we will be doing in the second session, but I want you to listen to this lecture from that perspective, that in the second session I would like you to think of the applications of the Fourier and the Laplace transform in your respective disciplines. I would also like many of us are also, I believe, from the discipline of electrical or electronics engineering, or also some people are from the maths background, I can see. How many of us are already familiar with the Fourier transform or Laplace transform? In fact, can I see your hands please? Many of us are, I am sure, it's not surprising. And how many of us are from the discipline of electrical engineering or electronics engineering? Okay, let me ask the question the other. How many of us are not from the discipline of electrical electronics engineering? Can I see? Okay, so you have almost half the class like that. So that's fine, actually that's welcome, because then we'll have a cross breed of discussion on applications in electrical electronics engineering and in other disciplines. Now, what I also intend to do in this session is to talk about certain geometrical notions that are relevant to the Fourier and the Laplace transform. And in the second session, what I would like you to do is we'll have groups in the class which comprise of some members who are in the discipline of electrical or electronics engineering and some members who are in other disciplines, and we would like to specifically pick some applications of these transforms and come and talk about them as if you were going to expose these ideas to a class, and we will then discuss how this should be discussed better or how this should be presented better. So, the second half of this, or rather the session after lunch immediately, will be a pedagogy discussion session on transforms. Is that all right? Typically after lunch it's difficult to absorb too many new ideas, so that's the right thing to do. Now, what I intend to do in this session is to talk about the relation between Fourier transforms and Laplace transforms and system theory. Many of you again might be familiar with these ideas, but I do hope that you will be able to hear some new, at least perspectives, if not necessarily theorems, or I am sure that a lot of what you listen to in this lecture would be known to you in one way or the other. So, you might be aware of those properties, you might be aware of those theorems, but what I particularly want you to pay attention to is the way in which we are looking at those theorems. So, I begin with the whole discussion on linear system theory. Now, this is not necessarily a part of the discussion on transforms, but I am taking this up because this is a point which we often don't emphasize. If you look at the way linear systems are presented, or more appropriately I should say linear shift invariant systems are presented, and particularly so in what you call a core course in electrical engineering. You have these core courses on control systems or in signals and systems or things like that. Students are often puzzled. Students often wonder why we are talking about these properties like additivity or homogeneity or shift invariance. Let me begin, and this is something I have been doing in several of the courses that whenever I teach a course on signals and systems, for example, I also use this strategy. Let me begin with two examples from two disparate disciplines. Let me begin with an example from electrical engineering first. Of course, the example is from electrical engineering, but I mean, as you will see, there are similar analogues in other systems. So let's begin with an electrical engineering example of the RC circuit. By the way, I always insist on all of you working with me, so I would recommend that you actually work with me. Otherwise, not too much would really be understood. So let's take the simple example of an RC circuit, a resistive capacitive circuit. I believe all of you would have notebooks and pens, is that right? So now here, let's focus our attention on the input voltage and the output voltage. So let's assume that a voltage is applied to a series combination of an RC circuit. So VIT is the input voltage and VOT is the output voltage here. Now, if you wish to describe the system, the best way to do it is using a differential equation. If you wish to describe the general behavior of the system, and the simple principle that we write down is essentially the Kirchhoff's voltage law here, right? So we write Kirchhoff's voltage law. So it says that the input voltage is the sum of the voltage across the resistance, and the voltage across the resistance can be related to the output voltage. In fact, that's R times the current, and the current is C times dVOT dt plus the voltage across the output. Now, I always like to begin with this example when explaining systems, because this is a typical first order system that you see in many situations. So you have a so-called voltage, input voltage being related to the derivative of the output voltage and the output voltage itself. It's a first order differential equation. It's also a very simple example of what is called a first order system. All right. Now let's take another discipline or domain. Let's take mechanical engineering or fluid, whatever, call it chemical engineering, wherever you have a situation in which you have a body moving through a frictional context. So you have a mass subjected to a force restrained in its velocity increase. Now, Professor Anant very beautifully said this morning that one of the first steps after you understood the physics of the situation, one of the first steps that you need to do is to simplify. Because if now for example here I have a mass, I'm applying a force to it, and obviously if everything is ideal, if the mass is just subjected to a force, you would see its velocity increasing without bound. Never does that happen in practice because there are always restraining forces. So obviously you would expect that the restraining force is going to be in some sense monotonic with the velocity. So the more the velocity, the more the restraint would come. That's how things work in practice. So when a car accelerates on the road, it ultimately acquires a reasonably steady speed because there are restraining forces by friction or whatever, right? So that we'll assume, now here we'll make a simplification. So we'll simplify the situation by saying the restraining force is proportional to the velocity. Restraining agent, whatever you want to call it, is proportional to the velocity. Now by velocity, of course, here you can equate it to speed because we are talking about one directional movement. So how do you model this situation now? You have a force being applied to the mass. That force needs to take care of two things. One is the contribution of m dv dt, that is, the accelerative part of the force, and the other is the moment as you increase the velocity, there is going to be a restraint on. So therefore, what is the situation? If you have a force, it contributes to the m dv dt component, and it also contributes to a component, let us call it kappa 0 Vt. This is the mass or the inertial component. So m dv dt is essentially from Newton's law, right, and this is the restraint to increase of velocity. When I taught this course, when I have been teaching this course under edX, currently we are running this massive open online course in edX. In fact, there I have explained this in even greater depth. So some of you who might be interested might want to go and see those first few sessions in the course. And I like to use this very simple example on many occasions because it illustrates a very simple idea. Let me put the two equations before you. I have this equation here. Vit is Rc are constants, okay, dVot dt plus Vot, and I have this equation here, F is equal to m dVt dt plus some kappa 0 times Vt. Obviously, there is a very great similarity in these equations. In fact, in a way, those equations are identical except for the interpretation of the constants. In this equation, what is Rc is in this equation what is m, if you notice. And in this equation, what is Vit is in this equation what is F. And of course, Vot goes at. Now, of course, there is a constant here. So, if I want to be really, if very finicky, I can divide out. So, I can say F by kappa 0 here is m by kappa 0 times dVt dt plus Vt. So, now the equations are exactly identical. Now, I have Vit is Rc, which is a time constant, I can call it tau dVot dt plus Vot, and F by kappa 0. So, F by kappa 0 can now be viewed as an input, and it is m by kappa 0, which is like a time constant there, or it is like a constant, first order constant dVt dt plus Vt. So, we have two different contexts. There is an electrical engineering context where you are dealing with resistance and capacitances, and there is a mechanical engineering, or well, in general, what you would call a mass and frictional context, which can occur in several different situations, not just mechanical engineering, could occur in chemical engineering, could occur in civil engineering, and you have essentially the same describing equation. And this is not new to us. I mean, this is the whole basis of what we call engineering mathematics. I want to begin this lecture with this point being emphasized. Whether it is system theory or whether it is engineering mathematics, much of what we learn in a first level course of engineering mathematics can always be linked not to one but to many different situations in engineering. And this is what we need to emphasize, in my personal opinion, when we address a first year class or when we address a class of people who wish to study engineering mathematics. In fact, when we teach signals and systems, I think this lies at the heart of signals and systems. When we abstract system theoretic notions like linearity or shift invariance, at the heart of it is the statement that I want to make my life easier, not harder. Very often, for example, people talk about the use of complex numbers in understanding electrical circuits. We will soon come to that, we will discuss that. and it looks rather silly at first glance to bring in complex numbers where actually all the quantities are real. So, where those complex numbers make your job easier needs to be understood, and we will discuss that as we go along. Here, for example, forget complex numbers. Here, what is it that we want to abstract? We want to abstract several things from here. We want to abstract saying that there is a general describing equation, a general system description of the form the input x of t is some constant, let us call it alpha times dyt dt plus b, well, we do not even have to have a beta, but you can say, just yt in both cases. And for the electrical system, xt is the voltage applied to the RC circuit. Let us write this down because it fixes ideas in our mind. And yt is the capacitor voltage. In contrast, when we look at the mechanical system, x of t is some kind of a ratio, it is f by kappa 0, and yt is a velocity finally acquired by the inertial component, or velocity acquired by the mass. Is that right? I will just flash the equation before you again. Now, there are several questions that we can ask about this system description. The first question is, suppose I were to apply two different agents. So, I were to apply, or rather I were to perform three different experiments. I were to perform one experiment in which I applied one agent, F1, one force. In the second experiment I applied another force. Of course, all these are functions of time. So, the force that I apply is a function of time, I mean the drawing or the pulling force or whatever. And in each case I recorded the way the velocity of acquired by the mass moves as or changes as a function of time. And the third experiment I put down the sum of these two forces and I look at what happens to the velocity in the case of the mass, and the same thing could be asked in the context of the RC circuit. If I applied a given voltage in one experiment, I applied another voltage, of course again as a function of time. So each experiment here, you could either think of them as identical circuits working all. See, the important thing here is that you must think of these experiments lasting forever in ideality. So again, this is an approximation. You are talking about all time, all independent variables. Now, very often people ask, I'm trying to bring out some of the, here I'm speaking pedagogy right from now. We speak of the three properties, or rather two properties. We speak of linearity and shift invariance. And many of us from the domain of electrical engineering will be very familiar with these ideas. Of course, we can also produce a definition for them, there is no problem. So, linearity again has two components in it, there is additivity and homogeneity or scaling. Now, additivity says this, it says that if I perform these three experiments, if I had one experiment in which I applied a certain, now let me use the word agent. So, xt, the input is the agent here, right. So, I applied one agent, the agent could be a voltage input or it could be a force which is pulling. What is the purpose of, see, what is the purpose of writing down what is called a system description? The purpose of writing a system description is to take away what is common from both these situations and to analyze both of them at once. The purpose of a system description is not to give answers which are specific to that context. For example, there are certain approximations in coming from the actual physical situation of a mass being subjected to restraint, I mean frictional restraint or any other restraint, and you have made approximations when bringing it to this model. And similarly, actually even in the electrical engineering context there are approximations. The capacitor is not ideal, it would have leakage resistance across it. The resistance is not ideal, it might have some inductive part in it. All these have been ignored when writing this equation. When we write down a system description here and when we analyze a system description, we are not competent to be able to answer the consequences of this approximation. We must be clear. So, as people who are now looking at the subject after having studied it formally, perhaps in a first level course or something, we must try and reflect on this. When we present this idea to our students, it's important right from the beginning to recognize what we are doing. When we teach system theory or when we talk about these properties of linearity and shift invariance, what are we trying to do? We are trying to abstract from both these situations certain things that we can answer at once. We are not trying to answer what happens as a consequence of making those approximations in the specific context. That has to be answered separately, or if there are similarities in that, so if there is a next order correction that we can do to improve this approximation, and if the second order corrections that we do are also similar to both the contexts, we can again bring them up as another system description and perhaps solve them together. But the aim of system description or the aim of what you call system properties and their description is to make our work lighter. I don't have to think separately whether I am talking about a mass and its behavior under a force or whether I am talking about an RC circuit. And by the way, you can take another example from civil engineering. The capacitance in the context of electrical circuits can be akin to a tank in civil engineering, and very often the pipe that brings water to a tank is often resistive in nature. So there are similarities. In fact, this is another task that I very often give, and I actually encourage you to do it. Some of you who might be coming with a civil engineering background or maybe even a fluid mechanical background might be able to answer this. Can one find a similar situation in fluid mechanics or in highly simplified model where I have what is akin to a resistance, what is akin to a storage or capacitance, right? So try and do that, and we will discuss that in the session after lunch. So once we do this, and once we have brought an abstraction forward, what have we gained from this? We have gained that we can try and solve one problem and simultaneously get answers in many disciplines. So once I solve this problem, which I am now putting before you, tell you the solution to xt is alpha dyt dt plus yt. It immediately answers for me some questions related to the electrical circuit and the mechanical circuit. What questions does it answer? So let's first ask certain questions about the properties that we expect or don't expect. Linearity has two aspects to it, additivity and homogeneity. What does additivity say? As I said, I perform 3 experiments. I have one x1t, one input xt, it produces a certain output yt. I have another input x2t, it produces certain output y2t. Now I apply the sum of these two inputs, x1t plus x2t, and I question what is the output produced. If the output is also y1t plus y2t, I say the system is additive. Now the moment I look at this equation, it becomes much easier to answer this question. Are these systems additive? In fact, it is easy to see the systems are additive, because if I now I think you may not want me to actually write down, that's very simple to do, but you can visualize it yourself. If I were to write down x1t here and solve for the y1t, I don't have to actually solve. I mean, I write down the relation between x1t and y1t, and then I write down similar relation between x2t and y2t. It's very easy to see that x1t plus x2t would produce y1t plus y2t as the output. So looking at the system description put down, it answers the question simultaneously for both the systems. The same way we can answer the question about homogeneity. So suppose, what is homogeneity? You need to perform 2 experiments on the system. I have applied an input xt on the system and I produce an output yt. If I multiply the input by a constant, the question is what happens to the output? Does it get multiplied now not just by a constant, by the same constant? If it gets multiplied by the same constant, we say the system is additive and is homogeneous. And that is very easy to see. If I multiply the whole equation by a constant, it is very clear that c times xt would produce c times yt. So the system is homogeneous. Now these are two of the three properties that we need to ask about. And I'll soon tell you why those three properties are important. The third property is a little more subtle. Suppose I were to displace the input in time. Now physically what that would mean is, suppose instead of performing the experiment today, I perform the experiment tomorrow. That's one example of time displacement. Or if I were not to perform the experiment starting this morning, but I were to start the experiment in the afternoon. And I would want to study how the output appears as a function of time. If I see that the output also gets displaced in the same manner in time, then I say the system is shift invariant. Now this is not so obvious but not too difficult to infer either. If I were to give, how do you express a displacement in time? You replace the variable t by t minus t0 or t minus lambda, whatever. So the subtle thing is to understand what happens to d dt here. The derivative operator is also shift invariant. So if I take a derivative of a shifted quantity, it amounts to shifting the derivative, right? So that property can be used here, and it's therefore easy to see that the shift invariance property is obeyed by the system. Now again, if you reflect on these, what is each of these properties trying to tell us? The linearity property, again broken into two parts, the additivity and homogeneity property, essentially talks about, well actually additivity talks about what happens when you combine agents, you bring two agents together. And it is important to emphasize to a student why this question needs to be answered. It is not uncommon for students to ask why we should be formally defining some of these ideas, additivity or homogeneity or particularly shift invariance. Why should we be defining them? What physical interpretations do they have? Homogeneity, for example, it's very, in our minds we tend to think that if we apply twice the input, we should expect twice the output. That is not true of many systems. For example, if I have a system which takes the absolute value, so a rectifier for example, I multiply the input by a positive number, of course the answer holds, but if I multiply the input by a negative number, it doesn't. So if I have a half wave rectifier, it could change the output completely. A half wave rectifier is one which retains whatever is positive and throws out whatever is negative, makes it 0. So if I multiply it by -1, the output is not multiplied by -1. So it is important, very often in a basic discussion on system theory, a mathematician is quite comfortable, and I am not trying to belittle mathematicians, or I am not trying to say that we should not do that. I am just saying that a mathematician is satisfied with a formal definition, but an engineer is not, or a technologist is not. And this is one of the things I am starting from a very basic example to explain why it is important for the mathematician to talk to the engineer. How many of you are from the mathematics departments here? Some of you are. So as I said, I am not trying to belittle mathematicians. In fact, I am trying to praise them by saying that they are content with a formal definition, but the engineers need more. Very often, while the mathematician appreciates the interpretation of the formal definition, the engineer is inclined to be dissatisfied with it, because the engineer wants to see the connection to not one reality but many realities. So in this class, for example, the electrical engineer will want to see the connection to the electrical engineering context, the mechanical engineer to the mechanical engineering context. And what happens in a course like Signals and Systems, if it is taught with care, is that that connection can be drawn with great ease. And in fact, it can be drawn with great ease only if the mathematicians talk to the engineers. Both have to gain from it, and that's what I am trying to bring out here. It's very important that to interpret these properties, for example, or to interpret these definitions, it's very important that there be a dialogue. Anyway, little bit about system theory. But why were these 3 properties important? In fact, there are 5 properties that one often questions in the context of systems. I have left out 2 of them. I will just mention them. The other 2 properties are causality and stability. I will come to those later, but we have intentionally omitted them from this. Why have we omitted them? Because the moment you see a system is linear and shift invariant, one very big thing happens. You get what is called a one experiment sufficiency. Do just one experiment. In fact, very often here again we talk about the impulse response. That is the most common way that we introduce, and some of you might be aware of this. How many of you have actually been using the impulse response idea in your discussion? Many of you must have used these ideas, isn't it? The impulse response and so we say, well, in the RC circuit, for example, if I were to find the impulse response, so in fact, if you see a typical textbook on signals and systems, it would quickly refer to an impulse response when talking about linear shift invariant systems. And what is the impulse response? I would say the impulse response is the response when the system is subjected to a sudden input which lasts for a very short time, if you ask me physically what it means. An input which suddenly injects something into the system for an almost 0 time and then vanishes. Practically, that is very difficult to do. Theoretically, it is very interesting, So the impulse response is a very beautiful idea. Practically, what would you do in an RC circuit, or what would you do in a mass? You would not simply suddenly jerk it and leave it. That is not how you would study. Most of the time, you would probably study the mass and frictional system by pulling it for some time. Or maybe in the context of the electrical circuit, you would study it by applying a steady constant voltage for some time, a step voltage, as we understand it. So, when we talk about linearity and shift invariance, it is common to immediately associate it with an impulse response, which is not wrong. It is true that a linear shift invariant system is completely characterized by its impulse response. Now, let me first explain that idea. By the way, all this leads to transforms. So, I am just trying to build things one after the other. Yeah. So, let me try and explain very simple language what an impulse response is. So, I have an arbitrary input. As a function of time, x of t. Now, I divide this input into very small regions of time, very small, and visualize making them smaller and smaller. And I asked the question, suppose I were to isolate only one of those little small things. So, I were to focus my attention maybe just on what this is doing to the system. You can visualize that if the input is continuous, as you go narrower and narrower, you will almost see this looking like a pulse. And you could think of a unit pulse. Now, you can visualize the situation. You can think of a pulse which becomes narrower and narrower, but as it becomes narrower, it holds the same area. That means it becomes taller and taller. So, what is important is holding the same area. Hold that area, but make the width tending to 0. And now think of this input as a combination of many of these things that hold some area but make the width 0. And ask the question, so don't yet make the width 0, ask the question, take just one such pulse which is lying around the point t equal to 0, let it hold some area and let it be applied to this RC circuit or to that mass frictional context and find out what the response is. Now, what does linearity and shift invariance tell me? It tells me, in fact, three things. It tells me first that if I shift this pulse to any other point in time, all the system will respond simply by shifting the output to that point in time. So the response to shifted pulses is not a problem. Now if I multiply that pulse by a constant, which you need to do if I want to take into account the value of the input at different points in time, then again there is no problem. If I multiply the pulse by a constant, the output is also multiplied by a constant. And the third thing is, if I now stitch together many of these pulses, if I put one pulse on another, and when I put one pulse on another, the beauty is that they are not overlapping, so they just recreate the input. So you can recreate the input by putting pulses together. If I put the pulses together with the spanner by recreating the input, the output can also be obtained by adding up the response to each of these pulses, appropriately shifted and scaled. That is, in a nutshell, why the impulse response, the impulse is the extreme case of this. When I have a pulse which becomes narrower and narrower but continues to hold some area. Why do we say it continues to hold some area? Now, for example, what is the meaning of that area in the context of the electrical system? So if I integrate voltage over time, what quantity does it give me? See, voltage can be associated, one way to understand is voltage can be associated with a rate of change of flux. So one interpretation that some people might want to give it is, it tells you about flux. But another way to think of it is, in a capacitor, the current is proportional to the rate of change of voltage. So when I integrate the current, I get a voltage, and if I differentiate the voltage, I get a current. All right. So it can also be related to quantities that are associated with these elements in that sense. In fact, in an inductor, the converse is true, right? So you have a now so therefore it's if we reason it out like this, it's very easy to understand why the impulse response is enough to describe a linear shift invariant system, because if I know what happens to each of these little pulses going everywhere, I know what happens to a composite input which can be brought by stitching all these pulses together. That's, in a nutshell, why the impulse response is adequate to characterize a linear. So the reason why we ask questions on linearity and shift invariance about a system is, it then tells me that I can perform one experiment on the system and I can know everything about the system. What do you mean by knowing everything about the system? I know how the system would respond to any input. Now, what is often not emphasized with as much vigor or energy is the fact that the impulse is not necessarily the only example that one can give of the experiment to be performed. In the RC circuit, or for that matter even for the mass frictional system, practically what one would do is not to apply an impulse. It would be silly to do that. One would apply what is called a step. So step response is what one would often study. So for example, in the RC circuit, the step response is very easy to understand. So if I were to, of course, if I want the system to behave linearly, the capacitor should be initially uncharged. And what is the corresponding concept in the mass and frictional context? The mass should initially be at rest, right? So I apply a unit step, that means a voltage which suddenly moves from 0 to 1, and I question what is the output. And we know what the output is expected to be. The output is expected to be of the form, I'll write it down, 1 minus e raised to the power minus t by tau. Of course, we write ut. Ut is a function which is 1 for t greater than or equal to 0 and 0 for t less than 0. Now, this is one example of an input that we can give. And in fact, if I again here, I can also reason out, can I relate these two ideas? So I have studied the unit step response is very easy to understand. Not only is it easy to understand, it's also easy to see experimentally. I can go into the laboratory and actually set up this circuit. I could suddenly keep the RC circuit unexcited and suddenly switch on a DC source, and I could look at how the capacitor voltage changes. So, practically speaking, although we can talk about the impulse response in theory, the step response is easier to obtain, and it is more useful to relate the step response to the impulse response. Now, how do you do that? So, take this unit step and shift it. So, I have ut and I take ut minus delta. This is ut at t equal to 0. So, the step comes at t equal to 0 and I shift it to t equal to delta. So, u of t minus delta. I subtract these. So, how will that look? The subtraction will look like this. From 0 to delta. And I divide by delta. So, I take a so-called, now this is again a bit of cheating here. I ask for a limit as delta tends to 0 of 1 by delta ut minus delta. We can't immediately answer the question, but let us try and reason out what are we doing here. So, ut minus delta is a small pulse that goes between 1 and 0 and delta, and you are multiplying it by 1 by delta. So, you have an area of 1 enclosed, 1 by delta multiplied by delta enclosed in it. So, as delta tending to 0 here is not correct mathematically in the sense that there is a problem of convergence at the points between 0 and delta. But anyway, suppose we sort of allow that to go through, so to speak, and that's what we do in the theory of generalized functions. This whole idea of impulse actually comes. So, for those of, so in fact, now here is where the mathematicians come in. The engineers, of course, understand the operational meaning of how an impulse behaves, but very often they do not understand certain nuances of how such things should be handled formally in a mathematical context. So, a mathematician should step in at this point and tell the engineer or the technologist what are the pitfalls of dealing with impulses. You shouldn't call them impulse functions, you should call them impulse, actually they are formally called distributions, right, generalized functions. Anyway, if we let this go through, we get what is called an impulse. So, when ut minus delta divided by delta is taken with delta tending to 0, it gives you a unit impulse. So, what does this tell us now again? You can now visualize applying this to that same system, and you don't, now what is important is you don't need to actually apply it and see the output. This is where the beauty of system theory comes up. You know what is the output for ut, the unit step response. You can calculate that experimentally or otherwise. Since it is shift invariant, you know what happens to ut minus delta. Since it is homogeneous, you know what happens when you multiply by delta. Since it is additive, you know what happens when you take ut minus delta. So, because of additivity, shift invariance and homogeneity, you know the output to ut minus delta into 1 by delta, and if you assume that behavior carries as delta tends to 0, then you have a very important inference that, well, in general, suppose ut were not the unit step. If I were to take ft and ft minus delta and so on, what are you doing? You are taking a derivative of the function at t equal to 0. So, if you take the derivative of function at t equal to 0, because of additivity, homogeneity and shift invariance, you would also see the derivative of the output over all time, right. So, that is an inference that is made again by observing system properties. Now, the unit step is of course one important example of an input that you could study. But in the context of the RC circuit, in fact, you also saw in the context this morning when Professor Anand talked about the fluid mechanical example, one part of the input or the behavior had oscillatory components. The oscillatory input has always been found very important in many systems. And just as we have talked about the importance of the impulse, and now we understand the importance of the step. So, if I know the step response, I can find the impulse response. and therefore I don't physically need to find an impulse response to be able to understand the system completely. The unit step response is equally adequate, right? So as I said, just as the unit step response is of importance, so is the response to a sinusoid or a sine wave. So sinusoid, the response of a sine wave, responds to a sine wave of the system. Now this is where the whole idea of transforms comes in. Now first let's take this, so let's first understand why sine waves are so interesting. Let's say I have two sine, now of course I am talking about sinusoids of the same frequency, so a sinusoid of a given frequency. So the typical form is A naught cos omega naught t plus phi naught. Omega naught is the frequency, angular frequency. Now, what is so beautiful about sinusoids? Three things are beautiful. First, if I add two sinusoids of the same frequency, I get a sinusoid of the same frequency. In other words, if I were to add A naught cos omega naught t plus phi naught and A1 cos the same frequency, omega naught t plus phi 1, I could write this in the form some B naught cos omega naught t plus say phi 2. And all of you know how to find out B naught and phi 2. Well, I will just quickly review it. What you need to do is to simply expand this trigonometrically. So you write A naught cos omega naught minus sin omega t minus, and collect the terms involving cos omega naught t, collect the terms involving sin omega naught t, and then use a squared combination of them. So you can rewrite it in this form. So when I add two sinusoids of the same frequency, I get a sinusoid of the same frequency. What are the other two? Now I am going to ask you, what are the other two? It's getting close to lunch and I can see some people are already dozing off. So what are the other two properties that are beautiful about the sinusoid? Well, the hint is that we have been talking about them just a minute before. Yes? That's correct. Yeah, can you say that in more detail? Okay. So, yes, yeah.
Even in odd functions of cosine and sine?
Yeah, right. Now, can you explain in more detail what you are saying?
For example, cos x.
We will use a mic. Yeah, please. So let me pass the mic around, right? So, mic la on kar. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, I think I have done that already. I'm D.W. Pandey from College of Engineering, Pune. I'm just telling you, sir, I'm not sure whether I'm right or wrong.
It doesn't matter, it's not. Yeah.
But in relation to, because the transform is there in head, I think I am moving towards that.
That's right.
So we have properties of sinusoids that these cosine and sine, they are even and odd functions. Cos minus x is equal to cos x is about cosine. Similarly, for sine, we have the other relationship. And they are periodic in nature.
Okay.
So cos of x minus x0 is cos x.
Yes.
So I think these two properties, they relate to periodic functions.
That's correct. In fact,
they're useful.
yeah, I mean, you brought out two very, so periodicity is in fact, how do we visualize, so what is the connection between periodicity and say shifting, right? So periodicity is a shift invariance in the function itself. Yeah. So when I shift the function, it remains unchanged with certain shifts, not with all shifts, but with certain shifts. That's what periodicity is. Right? So in fact that property is very important. In fact, it tells us something about how linear shift invariance is. In fact, it tells us something about how shift invariant systems would behave with periodic inputs. See, very often if I were to give a periodic input to a shift invariant system, what do you expect? The input itself is such that if I shift it by certain, well, multiples of the period, it remains unchanged. So what do you expect the output? The system is shift invariant, so when I shift it, the output is going to get shifted again by the same quantity. So if I shift it by those amounts, by the multiples of the period, I should also see an unchanged output there. Because the input becomes the same, so the output has to be the same. So shift invariant, so it's very easy to infer from here that shift invariant systems bring a periodic output of the same frequency in general. That's Professor Pandey has very beautifully brought out that process. Sinusoids have this property in particular. You are periodic with a certain period. So when I shift the whatever is the output to a sinusoid, we don't know what it will look like. Whatever is the output to a sinusoid, if I were to shift it by a multiple of the period, I should see the same output. So I expect the output to be periodic. Very good, that's one point. But in fact, what I also want to mention is that suppose I shift a sine wave, how does it still remains a sine wave? I was trying to point to that. So there is that kind of, so the sinusoids remain sinusoids on shifting. So that's the second property. There's one more very easy property. If I multiply a sine wave by a constant, it still remains a sine wave. Is that right? Now the second two are not as striking. The fact that when I shift it looks, those are obeyed by many. So in fact if you multiply a triangular wave by a constant, it still looks like a triangular wave. If you multiply say a partial exponential, it still remains, all those maintain the same. So the shape remains unchanged on multiplication by constant is not something very great. Shifting also very often keeps the same shape, is not very great. But the additivity property is interesting. It's not true for triangular waves, for example. If I were to take two triangular waves and if I were to add them, it would not remain triangular. Not difficult to, isn't it? Of the same frequency, I mean. While triangular, take square waves. So if I were to take two square waves which are periodic, I'll show them one this way and one dotted. You can easily see if I add the dotted line and the solid line, it's not going to be the same square wave now. It's going to have some periods, in some places it's going to become double, in some places it's going to go to zero and all kinds of things. So a simple wave like the square wave does not obey this property of additivity, right? Sinusoids do, and that's why sinusoids are given great importance in system theory. We build the whole transform out of sinusoids. In fact, we go to the extent of saying that if I can understand what the system does to a sinusoid, and if I can think of all my input as made up not of pulses but of sinusoids. See, initially I talked about the impulse response, and my justification for using the impulse response was that I can think of an arbitrary input as a combination of these teeny-weeny impulses, these teeny-weeny pulses which are all located at different points, and when you stitch them together, they form an arbitrary input. That's easy to see and understand. Now what we are doing in a transform domain is something that is not so easy to see, but which is often true, that we can bring together many sinusoids and also achieve the same effect. So for example, if I were to take a periodic function, I could find out what happens to a sinusoid of a given frequency. I could express a periodic function as a combination of sinusoids of that frequency, and I could invoke the property of additivity then to infer what happens to the overall sine wave. Let me explain. Let's take the RC circuit again. Now because sine waves obey this property, if I were to apply sinusoids to a linear shift invariant system, what do I expect the response to be everywhere in that system? Let us try and reason out. Well, let me have your inputs. What do you think the response should be? And why do you think so? See, my question is, I apply a sinusoid, a sine wave, as an input to a linear shift invariant system. You know what linearity and shift invariance means. What do I expect the output? Suppose that linear shift invariant system has many different points from which I can tap off, like the RC circuit has. You can look at the output across the capacitor, you can look at the current in the circuit, you can look at the voltage across the resistance. All of these are linear shift invariant relations. So my question is, what do you expect the output, or for that matter, Suppose I didn't have so many points to tap off. Simply, I had just one input point and one output point. And I asked, if I were to give a sinusoid as an input to the circuit, to the linear shift invariant system, what do you think the output should be? What is your, of course, here I'm not assuming any complex numbers and things inside it. So it has all the components have real relationships, right? They will operate with real numbers. So what do you expect and why? What is your sinusoid? Why? That is important. The answer, many people know, but yeah, please pass the mic around. What? Introduce yourself and yeah. Although you have introduced yourself in the beginning, frankly, I don't think all of us remember everybody's names, so it's a good idea to,
Gladden from Government Jungle at Thrissur, Kerala.
Very good, yeah.
Sinusoid obeys the property of linearity
Okay.
as well as shift invariant.
Now, what I want you to give is a justification. You said that if I give a sinusoid as the input to a linear shift invariant system, I expect the output to be a sinusoid as well. So, can you justify this? And I am trying to bring out that the justification should not have to depend upon the internal structure of the system. So, I shouldn't have to see there's a resistor inside the system or a capacitor. Okay. Can you give me a reasoning which tells me the answer? That's very good. So, yeah, yes?
Yeah. Sir, I think if you break the input sinusoid into smaller pulses, there are pulses of different magnitudes coming in.
Okay.
So accordingly, the output should also be changing correspondingly. So the property of homogeneity for linear system should be applicable there. If the system is linear and the input is sinusoidal, the output should also be sinusoidal.
No, but why is this specific to a sinusoid then? That could also be true for a triangular wave. Yes?
In the system equation you have d by dt.
Yeah, pass the mic, that's interesting, yeah. In fact, I forgot another beautiful property of a sinusoid, we forgot, which madam will now bring out. Yeah, you can introduce yourself and tell us about that.
No, I am Bindu Jia from College of Engineering, Trivandrum.
Yeah.
No, in the system equation, the general equation, you have a differential d by dt.
Yes.
So if it is a sinusoidal signal, even if you differentiate it, you end up with another sinusoid.
That is true. That's another beautiful property of a sinusoid. If a sinusoid is different, subject to the action of a derivative or an integral, it remains a sinusoid of the same frequency. That's another beautiful property of a sinusoid. That's correct. Now, would you like to answer the question? So, if I give a sinusoid as an input to a linear shift invariant system, what can I expect the output to be?
The output also will be sinusoidal
Yeah.
because all
will
the other properties which the system has, that shift variance, additive, everything is being obeyed by the signal also.
Okay.
So the output essentially will be sinusoidal in nature itself. Whatever we said for the impulse is
Yeah.
applicable in the sinusoidal also,
True.
but not for the other signals.
Yes, so no, but can you bring out that nuance? So, why is something very special about the sinusoid and not? If I were to, for example, can I confidently say that when I give a triangular wave as the input to a linear shift invariant system, the output has to be a triangular wave? Can I say that? That's not even true, right?
Not.
If I give it to a differentiator is a linear shift invariant system. That's not true. It will not give you a triangular wave. See, what are the three things that we've observed about a sinusoid? If I add two sine waves of course, sinusoids are the same frequency. So visualize giving a sinusoid to the input of a linear shift invariant system. Now, if I were to shift that sinusoid, it still remains a sinusoid and the output should have been shifted by the same amount because it's shift invariant. If I were to scale the sinusoid, I would see the same scaled output, right? Now, if I were to add these two inputs, that is the beautiful part. If I were to add these two inputs, both of which are again sinusoids of the same frequency, the output should also add, right? Now, what is the situation? When I add these two inputs, which are sinusoids of the same frequency, again I am giving it a sinusoid of the same frequency. So, I should observe the same shape at the output. So, I want an output which maintains its shape even when I shift it, scale it and add such shifted and scaled versions. How many functions of that kind are there? You see what I am saying? That's a subtle point. We don't often think of it from this point of view, do we? Right? We teach the Fourier transform with great elegance in engineering, but we often wonder why should we talk about sine waves? Of course, this is not the only reason. For the electrical engineer, there is another reason. Sine waves are the best ways to generate voltage. So, I mean, when you try and generate a voltage by using a generator, you are trying to get as close to a sine wave. In fact, you would like your 50 hertz power supply to give you a sinusoid, as much as possible, though it doesn't really. It has a bit of harmonic content or deviation from sinusoid. But actually, if you look at the ideal generator, it would generate a sine wave. If you look at the Faraday generator in the ideal sense, it would generate a sine wave. But because of contacts and such things, it deviates from a sine wave. So from a generation perspective also, sinusoids are important. In many physical contexts, sinusoids come naturally as a solution to certain differential equations. So sinusoids have certain physical properties. There are many physical reasons why sinusoids are also desired. But the most important, the moment you see a system is linear and shift invariant, to give it a sinusoid as an input. If you just use reasoning on what you expect the output to be, you want the output, it's like a puzzle, you want this output to obey this property. I scale the output, of course the shape is the same, no problem. I shift the output, it maintains the same shape, no problem. But when I add up these two, I've scaled and shifted the output and I've added up to the original output. It should still maintain the same shape. Now tell me how many shapes of that kind. Would a square wave do that? If I were to shift it, scale it and then add it to the original square wave, it would not remain a square wave. Would a triangular wave do that? No. So when you start thinking which waveforms are going to give you this property, I shift that waveform, scale it by a constant, add it to the original waveform, and it should continue to look like the same shape. So sinusoids, now it tells us why we are so fascinated with sinusoids, why we should build a whole transform around sinusoids. What is this transform that we build around sinusoids? So let's take the RC circuit again. So one thing I know for sure, if I give a sine wave, now I am convinced that if I give a sine wave here, right, so I give some A naught cos omega naught t plus phi naught here, I should see a sine wave everywhere. I should see a sine wave as the voltage across the resistance, as the current in the resistance, as the voltage across the capacitance and the current in the capacitance. All of them should be sinusoids. What will be different at different points? The amplitude and the phase. So that is one step, right? You see the amplitude and phase is different. So what do I do next? I say, well, can I think of any arbitrary, so let's go step by step, right? The next step is, suppose I have an arbitrary periodic function, not a sinusoid. So I give xt, which is periodic with period t, xt is equal to xt plus t. Suppose I am able to express this xt as a linear combination of these sine waves. Now again, the question will come, which frequency should be involved in those sine waves? Can you have any arbitrary frequencies coming together and forming this periodic function? The answer is no. If you take two sine waves whose frequencies are irrationally related. So for example, suppose you take the frequency, say 1 hertz and square root 2 hertz. I am giving an example of an irrationally related pair of frequencies. If you add them, is the sum periodic? I am asking a question. So I am asking, is this function periodic? Or sine t, right, plus sine root 2t. It's a simple question, no? We don't think about them too deep. Yeah, you're saying it's not periodic? Periodic, what is the period? How many of you vote for periodic? How many of you vote for not periodic? Yeah, that's the problem in our country. We have this not, what is it? No, what is that thing called? I mean, the third option which you don't. Huh? None of the candidates is okay. Yes? So different periods, is it an issue? So like for example, so is this function periodic then? Sin 2t plus sin 3t, is this periodic? What about the second one, sin 2t plus sin 3t, is it periodic? It's periodic. What is the period? Well, I mean, yeah, I think what she means by one is that, the one is the fundamental angular frequency, that in that sense. So, see, sin 2t plus sin 3t is indeed periodic. In fact, you can think of 2 and 3 both as multiples of the angular frequency 1. So, if you take the period of the angular frequency 1 means the period is 1 by 2 pi. That's the period. So, all of them would be periodic with a period 1 by 2 pi. That is, so the sum also will be periodic with a period 1 by 2 pi. What is the case for sin t plus sin square root 2t? The sum is not periodic. That means, if I want to bring together sine waves and if I want the sum to be periodic, the only way is that the sine waves should all have periods which are multiples of a fundamental, or they should be rationally related. They should be of the form p by q. So if it's of the form p by q, you can find a certain basic period. That means I want to write down in this periodic function, is that here? Yeah, yes. The shift in variance should be incorporated. That is correct. So if I want to bring sine waves and if I want to bring them together, and if I want to retain the periodicity, then I have to choose my frequencies properly. Again, of unit magnitude first and then of arbitrary magnitude. When I bring them together means adding them, and then the output should also get added. So additivity and homogeneity together would give me this ability to combine, right? So how would I then decompose xt, or how can I think of xt as a combination of different sine waves? So how should I write that down mathematically? Combination of L going from 0 to infinity, some EL cos L times 2 pi by t. So there would be a phase and an amplitude, isn't it? I know the frequencies. Frequencies are known now. I don't know the amplitude and I don't know the phase. So what geometrical intuition can I use here? So to use a geometrical intuition, I first need to start looking at these sine waves in a totally different light. Or I need to start looking at functions in a different light. So let's go to a totally different context in engineering, vector analysis. Now, how do you represent a how do you represent a two-dimensional vector? You represent a two-dimensional vector by using two coordinates. So for example, say x cap plus y cap, or x1 cap plus x2 cap. X1 and x2 are the two perpendicular directions. So x1 cap plus x2 cap really says you have two components, 1, 1. So two-dimensional vector is expressed with two coordinates. How do you express a three-dimensional vector with three coordinates? How do you express well, you can't see a 4-dimensional vector with your eyes, but you can write it mathematically. How do you express a 4-dimensional vector, n-dimensional vector with n coordinates, n independent coordinates? And you can carry this to infinity. So you can keep indexing, say coordinate number 0, coordinate number 1, coordinate number 2, coordinate number 3. You can keep doing this from minus infinity to plus infinity. So you can have an infinite dimensional vector indexed by its coordinates. That is what is a sequence. So for example, if I were to write down what was the conversion value for rupee to dollar over the last, let's say, 50 years, right, every month by month, I would get a sequence sorry, in which the time unit is 1 month, right. Now of course the dollar can fluctuate every day also. So within that, you can start making this a more and more continuous function, right. So you can now visualize this going to continuity from discrete nature. That means at every point now, at every month you had a coordinate, and now in every day, at every day you have a new coordinate now, so you can visualize that the coordinates become denser and denser. And then of course the coordinates can become even finer. So in the afternoon and morning there can be a different rupee dollar conversion. So now you can visualize the coordinates becoming a continuum. So every point in time is a new coordinate. Is this getting across, right? Of course many of you are probably familiar with this idea. So how many of you are already familiar with this perspective on functions? Is that all? None of the others are. Anyway, so every point, but how many of you have not understood what I just said? Can you raise your hands please? What I just said, how many of you have not understood? I am saying, start from a 2-dimensional vector, go to a 3-dimensional vector, go to an n-dimensional vector, then go to an infinite dimensional vector, but those dimensions are discrete. Now you go further, think of, as I said, first think of monthly dollar rate, then daily dollar rate. So you come down, make it even finer. Then you come down to half daily, and you can keep doing this. So every point in time now becomes a new coordinate, and the points in time become closer and closer. Is this point? How many of you have not understood this? Right? Okay, how many of you understood this? Can you raise your hands, please? Yeah, that's reassuring. Yeah. So otherwise, that same not to vote kind of thing might be there. So now, so you see, every point in time is a new coordinate, right? Now, how do I suppose I have a force in 2 directions. So I have a force, say fx or fx x cap plus fy y cap, and I have a unit vector. Let's call it u, ux, and the unit vector has x and y components. Or for that matter, not a unit. So you take any vector v, vx x cap plus vy y cap. How do I find the component of f along v? What would I do? That's very elementary, isn't it? What do you do in vector analysis? You take a dot product, an inner product. How do you take the inner product? You multiply corresponding components, fx vx plus fy vy. Now you can take this argument also to more and more dimensions. So you can multiply component by component, right? So if you have a 3-dimensional vector, you can multiply component by component. If you have a 4-dimensional, n-dimensional, infinite dimensional, and that infinity also can come to a continuum. So finally, if I have 2 functions, if you think of 2 functions, x of t and y of t, you can think of them as vectors, right? What kind of vectors? How many dimensional? Infinite dimensional, and the infinity also is uncountable, because you have the time axis with every point in time giving you a new coordinate. So it's an infinite dimensional. Now, how would you find an inner product between these? An inner product can be found by multiplying corresponding components, yt times xt. And instead of adding, as you would do for the finite dimensional case, you would now integrate over all t. So this tells me how I could find the component of one function over another. This idea of, now this word dot product is generalized to inner product. we use the term inner product in a broader context. The word dot product is meaningful when we are talking about small dimensional spaces like 2 and 3 dimensional, but the formal term used in functional analysis is inner product. So now can I invoke this idea? Suppose I want to express this xt, which is periodic with period t in terms of sine waves. What should I be doing? So again, let me write that down. Let me write down what I finally want. I finally want something like this. Now let me break this a little bit. Let me take the A01 separately and let me break the 1 to infinity separately. So AL cos omega L, cos phi L, I'm sorry, cos 2 pi by t times LT plus AL sin omega L, sin phi L, sin 2 pi by t times LT. Now, when we talked about this business of multiplying component by component, there is one specific assumption we made. We found those components were perpendicular. You see that perpendicularity was assumed. So what is perpendicular? If I take the dot product of x cap with y cap, it is 0. So perpendicularity is, in other words, expressed by the inner product being 0. So now I should first ask myself, what is the inner product of, now how do you define inner product? You see, now I am talking about a periodic function. So I need to focus my attention only on one period, because what is happening on one period is going to happen on all the other periods. Is that right? So I need to focus my attention only on one period. So let me take, without any loss of generality, take the period 0 to t. Okay, one period. And find the inner product or dot product of any of these functions, any two. Which are the functions that you need to deal with? The constant function. You see, what is A0? A0 is a constant. So you have a constant that is 0 frequency. So it's a constant function. You have, which are the other two functions? Cos 2 pi by t times LT is another function, and sin 2 pi by t times LT is another function. So these are three kinds of functions that I need to look at. Let's take any two of them. Let's take a constant function. Let's say, and that constant can be 1 without any loss of generality, 1 for all. Second function is cos 2 pi by t LT. Third is sin 2 pi by t LT. Now take the inner product of any of these, any pair of these. How many possible inner products do I need to check? I am going to check only 2 and leave the rest to you. I can take the inner product of, in fact, you should in principle be taking the inner product of any of these by any of these, including themselves, right? So for example, I should be able to take the inner product of a constant with sine, constant with cos, cos with sine, and cos with cos of different frequencies, sine with sine of different frequencies, all these possibilities. Now I will show you one or two of them. Let's take the inner product of a constant with either cos or sine. I'll show you cos, and the same thing holds for sine. Now in fact, I don't even, you can take 0 to t, no problem. How much is this? This will essentially be sine 2, I can integrate it formally, of course. Of course, L is not equal to 0 here. So I can write 2 pi by t times L and 0 to t. Of course, it's very easy. What is the answer here? Obviously, the answer is 0, right? And you can see that the same thing will happen for sine. And in fact, we have said nothing very great. We have said that if I take a sine wave, which is, I have taken a number of periods of the sine wave, if I integrate the sine wave on more than one period, the integral is going to be 0. So constant is perpendicular to any of these, sine and cosine. Now take two different sines or two different cosines. Take the sine and cosine first. So take cos 2 pi by t times LT times sine 2 pi by t times LT and integrate it over one period. It's very easy. This is half sine integral of very simple. It's essentially half integral sine 2 times this frequency. So obviously, so in fact it comes to 0 again, because this is essentially the double frequency component here. The same thing will happen when you take cos with cos of the same frequency and sine with sine of the same frequency, right? So all of those would integrate to 0. And finally, if I take cos of two different frequencies or sine of two different frequencies, so if I take cos 2 pi by t times Lt times cos 2 pi by t times kt, k and L are not equal to 0 and k not equal to L. It's very easy to see this is also equal to half integral 0 to t. Well, it's cos 2 pi by t k plus L times t plus cos 2 pi by t k minus L times t. So again you have the same story. You are taking an integral of two sine waves over a period, and both sine waves are periodic with period t. So all of these products, all of these inner products are 0. What does it mean? It means that we already have a good situation. All these are perpendicular components. So now our job is very easy. I can find out A0. How do I find out A0? Simply multiply. How do you find out the component? Multiply the original vector by a unit vector in that direction and then do that for each of this. So how do I find out A0? A0 is essentially the average. Now it is the average, but this is when you multiply, when you take the inner product or you take the dot product of a force with a vector, it doesn't give you the component along that vector. For getting the component, what else should I do? I should also divide by the magnitude of the vector. So I should take a unit vector in that direction. Now how do I get this unit vector business? So I first need to, so if I want to get a unit vector, I should divide by the magnitude of the vector. So how do I get the magnitude? How do I get the magnitude of a vector from, can I use the dot product to do that? I can take the dot product of a vector with itself. So if I take the vector, dot product of a vector with itself, what does it give me? The square of the magnitude. So if I take the square root of that, it will give me the magnitude. So if I take this vector with itself, 1 multiplied by 1 dt, integrate it over t, how much does it give me? T. So t is the magnitude square of this vector. So what is the magnitude of this vector? 1 square root of t. That's a ugly number to deal with, isn't it? So what should I do? I should then, strictly speaking, I should have divided by square root of t. But I have a saving. See, I need to divide by square root of t when finding the component. And I also need to divide by square root of t when reconstructing. So I can play a game by doing it in one place. I can either bring the square root of t on the analysis side when I am finding the component, or I can bring the square root, both the square roots t on the synthesis side when I am reconstructing. So I will choose to bring it on the analysis side. So multiply square root of t by square root of t again on the analysis side and divide by t instead of square root t. So I will say a0 is 1 by t times xt dt. So essentially that's easy to calculate. It's the average of the function over the interval t. Now when you do that, when you reconstruct xt from its components, you don't need to bring in that unit vector business again. The unit vector has been taken care of here. Similarly, how do you get the other components? How will I get the component? How will I get a0 al cos phi l? Integral xt times, of course, cos 2 pi by t times lt dt, and I need to divide by something. Now how much should I divide by? Again I use the same principle, multiply cos by itself, cos squared 2 pi by t lt dt, integral from 0 to t. Now how much is this? Now you see, cos squared can be written, it's very easy algebra, so you can do it yourself, but it's the form cos 2 times that, plus 1 by 2. Now the cos 2 times that integrates to 0, so double frequency component goes away. Only 1 by 2 is left, so 1 by 2 dt gives you t by 2. So t by 2 is the square of the magnitude. So again I use the same principle. I don't need to, so strictly I should have divided by 2 by square root 2 by t. Here I should again divide by square root of 2 by t on the synthesis side. So I bring them together and I say I don't do it in both places. I simply divide by 2 by t here. Is that clear? Everybody is fine with this? Everybody understood this? Okay. Similarly for sine, no problem. Minus al sine 2 pi l t can be found in the same way. So it's a very interesting. So in fact, this is what the Fourier series, this is what is called the Fourier series decomposition. So you have made a Fourier series decomposition of the wave xt, a periodic function with period t has a Fourier series decomposition which you can find in this way. But when you interpret the Fourier series decomposition in this way geometrically, it all makes sense, otherwise it looks like a bunch of formulae, right. So it's very important to give this interpretation to the Fourier series. Now, so you see, I mean, if you take the RC circuit, the good thing is, if I know how the RC circuit behaves with one sine wave, and if I know I am applying a periodic function to that RC circuit, I can decompose that periodic function into all these constituent frequencies. I can find separately the output to each of these constituent frequencies, and I can then find the output by taking, because of the property of additivity, since the system is additive, I can find the output by adding the outputs to each of these sine waves. Suppose the input is not periodic. Now what do we do? So, there again we can invoke, it's a game on language. So if you say it's not periodic, how do you get a function which is not periodic? You make the period larger and larger. So as you make the period tend to infinity, the function becomes aperiodic. That means if you make the function tend, if you make the period tend to infinity, what are you doing to the fundamental frequency? The fundamental frequency is going towards 0. So now instead of having discrete frequencies, you have a continuum of frequencies. All the frequencies on the angular frequency axis have to come in to form that function. Now, there are some subtleties here. Are you guaranteed that when you do this? So, for example, suppose you have a function like this, a function that grows exponentially, e raised to the power 2t for t greater than or equal to 0. Can you know, here it is not too difficult to answer. Can you ever create this function by using only sine waves of any number of frequencies? Well, sine waves are going to be periodic, so it's not too difficult to see, if you think a little bit, that no matter how many sine waves you bring together, they will never come to a function like this, which grows exponentially in time. So when you use these arguments, see, when you go from finite dimensional to infinite dimensional, there are some places where you can stumble, and that is where the mathematicians need to step in. Engineers would confidently and wrongly, find out, they might even find a Fourier transform for this, but there is no Fourier transform for this. The mathematicians need to then caution the engineers. You can't find a Fourier transform of a function which is not of finite energy, it's not finitely integrable. What is the Fourier transform? The Fourier transform is a limiting case of this. When you take the frequency, the fundamental frequency goes to 0. That means when the period goes to infinity, then you need to bring in all the frequencies on the frequency axis. And you need to use the same idea. So what is the Fourier transform? The Fourier transform is really the dot product. The Fourier transform is again an inner product. Now, in fact, it's an inner product, so now a Fourier transform actually requires two inner products. It requires a cos omega t dt and a sin omega t dt. Like we had in the Fourier series representation. You had to have a cos and a sine. Now, you could of course continue with this, having two different functions, but it is better in a transform to have one definition and then use it, differently when you were dealing with different situations. So how can we make this one definition? So I think we'll break for lunch here and then we'll continue discussion after lunch.